So it's a pleasure to welcome my colleague Helen Brown here today. You might recall there was a very innovative call from Movember back in the fall of last year, and where you would submit a video and with a pitch with an idea for some research that might do. So we were so thrilled to hear that Helen's work had been funded. A project titled Work to Give, enlisting positive masculinities for meaningful work for incarcerated Aboriginal men in British Columbia. And I guess it's we're probably 12 months down the track now, not quite, with this particular project, and it's so great to have Helen here. She's an associate professor with the School of Nursing, currently on sabbatical, so it even makes it more exciting that she's joined us for some work here today. And I'm just delighted to be able to host her and to have an opportunity to hear about the project and how it's going.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, John. Well, it's John and I were just reflecting on the virtual audience that will find their way to this presentation. So just whoever you are, whoever finds this presentation, thanks for your attention, and I'm really excited to talk about this project. It's one of those experiences that, you know, as researchers we move in many places, and suddenly I find myself, my background is maternity care, neonatal intensive care, and suddenly about a year ago I found myself in a prison out in the Fraser Valley as a researcher, thinking, the greatest thing about academic work is that you end up in these most amazing places, and the stories of how you ended up there are I think quite fascinating, which could be a whole other presentation, but I'll try to weave in a little bit about the background of this project. As John mentioned, it is the title actually evolved to be what it is because of what Movember was focused on. My project partners in the prisons and in the communities have said to me many times, what's a positive masculinity and what does that mean? And so the title really did evolve because of the focus that Movember has on positive masculinities to promote men's mental health. When I looked back over everything they funded in the fall, when the announcement came out, we also saw that we had the longest title. So we're also trying to revise it, but we really wanted to keep the focus on the prison context, the idea of meaningful work, and the importance of the masculinity and incarceration context. So we thought we'd be further along, and I thought when I agreed to do the webinar that I'd have a lot of data to share, but I think the journey of getting this project off the ground, sharing with you what we've decided around design decisions, and talked about and share with you some of the methodological complexities of even kicking off a project that is a partnership between a federal institutions, communities, Aboriginal communities in British Columbia, and an academic partner. There's some pretty interesting nuances of how that work gets even off the ground, which is a good reminder to all of us that you don't get a grant and start. There's so many parts of the work that unfold, and the attention to those relationships, those different contexts, and the various players that operate in different places is often the months and months before the research begins. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So the focus, I thought, today would be to give you a bit of a background in terms of the story of Work to Give, because we were funded to do research on an already existing project. And that's pretty important because the history of the project is data for us as researchers. And so the context of the research, the story itself is important. So in 2012, a Correctional Services of Canada project began. It was never called a program, and that's really important because a program signals something about sustained funding. This was almost like a pilot project. There was a retiring warden at the time named Brian Lang who noticed that there were significant challenges within prisons, which of course are well known in terms of their capacity to provide meaningful work and effective rehabilitation in those institutional systems. And so he, at the time, was living in the Cariboo-Tsilhqot'in region and started wondering, and was starting to think about a sort of restorative justice initiative as part of his retirement work. And he started asking questions about, was there a way that men in the institutions could actually start engaging in meaningful work that gave them a sense of value, that could help them give to impoverished First Nations children? he wasn't necessarily thinking about Aboriginal men at that point, but he was thinking about one of the most impoverished territories in BC is the Cariboo-Tsilhqot'in, and across many, many indicators in terms of childhood, child development, high school completion, absolute relative poverty, nutrition, prenatal nutrition, across many, many indicators, has some of the poorest living conditions and health outcomes in the province. And so, having worked in the prisons all these years, and then living in the area and seeing the needs, started thinking about, why don't we shift our thinking around the models of rehabilitation and start giving men the opportunity for more meaningful work. And so he had spent years watching guys do groundwork, clean bathrooms, enroll in what were called CORCAN programs, and still are. So those are programs to develop employability, to finish high school diploma work. So looking at the host of programming and realizing that in a sense it was effective, but there was something not tapped in terms of men's sense of value and that connection to rehabilitation. And so the project began across 3 federal institutions, and he became the conduit as a retired warden between the communities and the federal institutions. And money was secured within the CSC budget and from donators and suppliers and other avenues to get this project off the ground. So that was in 2012. And so I'll share a little bit about the project, but then shift specifically to the research that we're going to be, that we're just now ready to get started on. I'll tell you a little bit more about the project context, because I think that gives the sort of background to the problem, if you will, that we're tackling in the study. And then focus a little bit more on the research partnership and design and methodological complexities of working across a federal community academic partnership. So there's often this reference to the work to give formula, and you hear the wardens talk about the formula, and it's like a mathematical calculation of benefit, and I think that that's the language of how they argue for its sustainability. And so when I, of course, was first out there, having come out of hospitals and neonatal ICUs and hearing this new language about work to give and the institutional context, it was quite I think, remarkable that this is how the project is still talked about. It's sort of a this plus this plus this equals this. And the idea is that incarcerated men, although there is programming, have significant amount of idle time. And the project originally had the picture of the devil on it within CSC, meaning the idle hands are the devil's work. And so that was almost the face of the project. If we can reduce idle time and we can engage men in meaningful work, we can promote better rehabilitation and even potentially shift institutional culture. So at the time that the project was getting underway, there was this view that sort of one man at a time, that we might actually, that the CSC programming would shift this dominant institutional culture. And it's no surprise, I'm sure to many of you, that the institutional culture has been well known to not facilitate rehabilitation in ways that sustain community integration and reduce reoffending rates or recidivism, and it's particularly worse for Aboriginal men. There's only a couple of studies, one in Alberta and one in Ontario, that show that recidivism rates are almost 20% higher for Aboriginal men, and that is directly linked to a quote-unquote failure of actually tailoring rehabilitation, institutional rehabilitation, to their unique needs. So that's a really important part of the story. So we know the prisons have real challenges with respect to the subculture, and so as I'm listening and learning about all of this a year ago, started doing some reading as the Movember campaign came out for the innovation grants, because of this important focus on masculinity. And that wasn't anything anybody was talking about around prison subculture and men's rehabilitation. And I did actually find one of not very many papers published on mental health, crime, or criminalization, mental health, and masculinity, the intersection of that. So it was fascinating to come across language and study about prisons and some UK, some particularly American, these studies were conducted, in language such as this, paramilitary paramilitary hyper-masculine structures within prisons. So this was the new layer that without the Movember, I think, theme and the innovation call, wasn't part of the language of the institutional subculture. And so Lutz and Bell write a lot about gender, masculinity, and crime, and then have done work looking at shifting prison culture and context at that very root, that gendered nature of crime. So very fascinating opportunity through Movember to start thinking through that. So the other part of the formula then is having the men do meaningful work for people in need. And the communities that were identified, as I mentioned earlier, were the Tsilhqot'in, which is how I've now realized the word is actually more appropriately pronounced in Tsilhqot'in. And that Tsilhqot'in caribou is really the name that non-Aboriginal people call the communities that span from the Nemaya Valley to Williams Lake to Stone Reserve further north and Anaheim Reserve. So Tsilhqot'in is the name that we are now using for the communities, and that this combination of giving and need has produced this project. So the goals of the project, as part of the backstory, improving the lives of Aboriginal children in this particular community by meeting basic needs and providing also cultural items. And that's an important part of what the men chose to make. Many of the men have wanted to make drums. Many of them are Aboriginal. The ones interested in the project are predominantly Aboriginal and are wanting to make those and find their way back to some cultural item making. So that's wasn't originally part of the project. It was in its inception. It was about meeting basic needs, but it's evolved to be something quite more expanded beyond the things that I'll show you. So it's providing, in the CSC language, opportunities to learn skills and make intrinsic changes to help them adopt these pro-social values and attitudes. And that is very much about the rehabilitation metrics that are reflective of the institutional processes. So adopting pro-social values and attitudes is the language of the institution. And with the overall goal to contribute to safer environments. So there's just a visual of how it works, and the original consultation with communities, the engaging the inmates in special projects, and then the third arm of that formula, which has become really apparent in the last 2 years, is securing donations and supply and distribution partners. So this is a guy I actually met. There's a CORCAN program, which is the federal, it's the hobby shop, and the guys from Work to Give are allowed to dumpster dive and get all the ends from the CORCAN project and bring them into the Work to Give project. It took me a long time to figure out, well, what's the difference in the hobby shop and Work to Give? And that's part of our study, is to understand the difference of a correctional rehabilitation program and this Work to Give meaningful contribution to the lives of others beyond the institutions. So the project is being conducted, actually, now it's up to about 6 different institutions, but the ones we're focusing on for the research, which is why these are here, are 3 institutions, and Mountain, which is a medium institution, Ferndale, which is a minimum institution, and Pacific, which is a minimum institution. And these are all in the Fraser Valley, from Mission, Abbotsford, and in Ferndale. And different items are being made at these different places. And some of them relate to the security level of the institutions. And so the 3 institutions are particularly important because who the inmates are that are there and the items that they're making. And I'll say a little bit more about that. The Tsilhqot'in communities are, as I said, span from Williams Lake to the Nenai Valley, all the way almost to Quesnel. And within the Tsilhqot'in region, there are 6 communities that we're studying in terms of the impact of the Work to Give project. And they're all governed by the Tsilhqot'in national government, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So just in terms of what I wanted to share is the research partnership, because I don't know about you, John, but I find I mean, every project is partly unique by who the partners are. You could have the same question in 6 studies, but who comes to the table to study it and how that affects how you do the research is always, I think, quite fascinating. So we have a CSC, Correctional Services of Canada, partner, we have the Tsilhqot'in Nation, and we have a UBC academic team. So we've got the feds, we've got the academics, and then we've got Aboriginal partners, which is a whole, I think you could just study the dynamics, and it's great. Or you could say, well, it's just 3 partners, but I think the nature of the partnership is probably going to provide much data, which I think is as exciting as the very thing you study is how you study it. Just a couple of things on the rehabilitation context, because it is important as background to the research, and that is that CorCam programs exist, and they generally take this form, hobby shops. There are different services that are available for inmates. So all in all, if you looked at the Canadian context, some would say our rehabilitation resources are significantly better than our U.S. counterparts. Aboriginal programming, there is a, I can't say the full name, but the short name is Kwì. It's a specific Aboriginal minimum security prison in the Fraser Valley that is, once Aboriginal men meet the various qualifications, can go and finish their sentence in that setting and then move into First Nations restorative justice courts in BC. So we really have a different kind of environment for rehabilitation than others, although not perfect when you think about broader institutions. Well known the backgrounds in, the problems in prisons that put in place the justification for the project in the very beginning. The project also, I think, is significantly now the context for understanding what the impacts of the project are, particularly with the focus on masculinity and crime, is what we know about mental health in prisons. And I think this is always going to be a justification for not only the sustainability of work to give in the prisons, but will also shape the context of the research, is that most mental health conditions are exacerbated or get worse when men are in prison. And some of the statistics look like, if in the UK there was a study in 2013 that of 2 million prisoners in the UK, almost 600,000 reported mental health problems in prisons. And so pre-existing are almost always exacerbated, and some are actually newly diagnosed within that context. And that further, that these unmet needs, and one of the things I've seen is not just sort of specific populations, there's all kinds of aspects of people's lives that when they collide or collude with the institutional context create a worse scenario for rehabilitation. And what I've seen at Pacific is there's actually a rehabilitation center at Pacific, and so those are men that have chronic illness. Many of them have fetal alcohol disorder, a whole host of health conditions in addition to mental health issues. And so the study is specifically going to focus on those men that have comorbid disorders because they're more than just mental health and social. There's actually comorbid physical conditions that have made the impact of being engaged in something meaningful even that much greater. The best example, one of the guys has asthma, and the room where they go and do their knitting has the best air in the whole institution. So he's actually getting better physiologically because for 2 hours a day he crochets in a room with air conditioning. So that's interesting. We never actually thought about the physiologic benefits of being, but it's access to a space and a place that actually makes him breathe easier. So. There's no air conditioning in some of the prisons that I've been in last summer when we were filming and getting ready for the pitch. Like the air movement is just, and for those older inmates who have heart conditions and others, it's quite surprising. So the idea is that the guys should go out better than they come in, and we know that that's not happening. So that's what Work to Give is about. I'm just going to move ahead. Just for reference for viewers, some of the recent statistics around overrepresentation of Aboriginal men in institutions, federal institutions, and that the the associations between criminality and socioeconomic conditions and trauma and life history are significant. And so, while we often hear the first bullet point, we don't often hear the second. And so, I urge anybody who are in situations where overrepresentation is the sort of the tagline, to add on the second tagline, that it's not just that it's not a race-based predisposition to crime. It's about lives and trauma and poverty in gang life, and how those things in crime, a life of crime. So that's something that wasn't actually a big part of the Work to Give story that the research, I think, is pushing, and so it's the layering on of that. Those important aspects of the problem, I think, are significant. So in 2014, as John mentioned, we, thanks to John, I think he alerted me to it, that we needed to put our hat in the ring for an innovation grant, and it was very much a call for new ideas, and so I was like, oh, a new idea. Well, it's not a sustained initiative, and so the new idea is to really demonstrate and show the impact for the evidence for scalability within corrections. And so, while not a new project, it was in its early stages, and our goal was to scale it up in terms of the research. And so it was a perfect fit. It's a practical and innovative solution to impact the lives of these men, promote meaningful work, rehabilitation, and very likely post-release community reintegration, and also impacting the lives of the children and families who are receiving the items. So in all of that, I think it's important to, did the research questions pre-exist our grant in Movember? I think we got the opportunity to think about our research questions differently, which is quite, I think, interesting, again, because of what Movember is about. So our original research question was, well, what is the impact that Work to Give is having on the men in terms of rehabilitation and on the lives of children and families in the Tsilhqot'in? And so that evolved a bit with the Movember call for projects in, promoting positive masculinity in the context of men's mental health. So our research questions expanded. How does participation in the project facilitate expression of positive aspects of masculinity? Taking control, work, and productivity are what we're hypothesizing are those positive impacts, and what are the men's experiences generally of participating? And then how do those positive expressions of masculinity actually play into the rehabilitation process more broadly? So experiences of men, but the larger institutional rehabilitation process. So that's an important part of our overall claim that these contributions are making a difference. And that's what CSC really needs to have research evidence to sustain work. And then the parallel there's two sub-studies almost within the whole. We're not calling them sub-studies, but the two arms of the study are looking at the impact of Work to Give on the Tsilhqot'in communities. And at this point, they're receiving furniture, clothing, gifts, and we're just starting to realize that much of what we're going to be studying in the communities is not so much what it felt like to get the stuff, but what it feels like, as the leaders have shown us, to contribute to rehabilitation of men, many of whom are connected to people in those communities through various family. And then we were really encouraged by our CSC partners to actually study how Work to Give impacts prison subculture. And so from a researcher perspective, that's particularly challenging, because you can't just, I always joke and say, oh, look, there's subculture, I'll just go get it, and then I can measure the difference we're having, and it's this amorphous thing that we need indicators of in order to understand the impact we're having. And so we haven't started really thinking through the design of that, but I have an idea, and it's really important because apparently the guys told us about, it's a con code, it's a code of conduct for cons. It's called the con code. One of the guys told me about it. He said, oh no, you can study institutional subculture. And I was like, really? How? Tell me how. Please tell me how. He said, well, for the first 6 months I was in the project, my cellmates, and when they were out in the yard, would say, hey, you're in that special projects building. Can you get me a Can you get me this? Can you get me that? Sometimes it's a tool, sometimes it's a chisel. Can you take stuff? And the code of conduct is that, there's bartering and trade system within the institution that privileges those who will act on behalf of others, like will get into fights to protect people. And so there's this, I don't fully understand it, but will soon when we start to talk more about it. And he said after 6 months of being in work to give, he turned and he said to the guy who said, can you get me whatever it was? And he said, yeah, I don't steal from kids. Which is meaning that everything in that workshop is to serve the production of things for kids. So if I take from here, I'm stealing from kids. So he told that story and we thought, that's institutional subculture. It's interrupting and those men taking a stand potentially in what they will and will not do that has supported the code in the past. So we think. So you can imagine the research design felt like a bit of a how are we going to tackle this, the complexity of the questions that we have. And so we have now refined our design, and Movember was more interested in the idea, less about the research design. So we had started thinking about it, but not to the fullest extent that we have now. So we are going to undertake this as a descriptive mixed methods cohort design, and that we really had to, because it's a participatory process, we had to come up with a design that the Tsilhqot'in partners kind of understood, well, what is that going to give to us? And our CSC, the wardens on our project, would give them, it had to have the kind of design features that would satisfy all the stakes that everybody had in the project. And so we needed a cohort design because we have men in different subpopulations within the prison. We have men with minimum sentences, we have men with comorbid health conditions, we have men making cultural items and others making furniture, and they attribute different meanings to those things. And so the idea that we would have subpopulations within the population of men was important. And they longitudinally are not all in sync, if you know what I mean. Like, they're not all doing the same thing all the time. So we actually have different cohorts within the institution. We need a primarily descriptive design because we're trying to describe the impact that this project is having. And that's what the CSC partners were really clear about. But we also need a mixed methods approach because we have institutional data and impact and metrics that we need to, if we can, start to connect engagement and work to give to improved rehabilitation metrics. And so we're starting to delineate what those are. And you can imagine that we can't necessarily control for the multitude of variables that are impacting each single inmate. But there are some aspects of their sentence, the nature of the crime, and their institutional pathway or trajectory that we can glean some associations. We are using ethnographic methods because we're focused on thick, rich description in context, the institutional context, perception and experience of impact, both inmates and communities. Communities is just the broader word for children, families within the Tsilhqot'in. And this impact analysis is really where our quantitative data will be. And it's interesting, the data kept on men is classified as CSC Corporate Results, and they're drawn from a copyrighted program called Performance Direct. So how these guys are doing is kept within a system called Performance Direct that feed into corporate results. And so we're trying to disentangle what those are and what are the ones that are important for our impact data. So the ones we've come up with, which has actually been a fair amount of work to figure out, well, what is connected to the idea of productivity and meaningful work. And our partners and the parole officers we've consulted with and a number of people within the federal institutions have said, oh no, it's institutional crimes, because if they commit less institutional crimes, then that's a sign that their rehabilitation is proceeding in the way, in a positive way. And so if engagement in the project could be associated with reduced institutional crimes, that is a plausible and arguable impact. security level. So you can imagine that when the men come in, depending on the nature of their crime, they will have a various security levels, and it dictates where they can go and come and how long they can be in different places, whether they can actually come to some of the core camp programs. And so as their security level lessens, is there an association or an impact from being involved in Work to Give? So we're trying to distill whether or not we can make some claims in terms of impact there. The other one is cell permits. So the inmates will get a chance to apply for a cell permit if they've demonstrated good behavior in a variety of forms, low institutional crimes, and have it consistent with a security level that's appropriate for a cell permit. And the guy said to us on the day I was out there, if I work hard enough in this project, maybe I'll get a cell permit to finish this. He was crocheting a blanket. I could finish the blanket in my cell. So that is, I think, something that we're going to be able to look at. The wardens are convinced that, no drugs in their urine is going to be a sign. That actually, if it's having an impact, we'll see a shift in the institutional culture and the drug culture and use of drugs in the institutions. That one feels a bit, we're going to have to think through a little bit more about biological markers. The one I do know is urinalysis, and we may be able to. But again, it's challenging because it's not an A to B kind of impact, and there's much to. But I don't think that means we don't have something we can, something useful there. So just methodological complexities I thought would be interesting to share, because it's like the story of the how of the research, which I always do find as fascinating as the what. So Correctional Services of Canada. So we're still in ethics approval with CSC. And the grant actually had to go in as an external. We have a CSC partner who wanted to be a project lead, co-lead, co-I, but it couldn't be pitched that way. So she has taken our partner, sort of a member of the team, and hasn't actually been able to sign on for the kind of leadership that I would have had in any of my other projects. It's her project, it's her idea, she called me, and yet I'm the PI. And so it's an interesting kind of authority in terms of positioning of the academic as the lead, and in all the other community-based work I do, I have a co-lead that is a community member or from a nonprofit organization or somewhere. So this was a bit, and it wasn't an option to make a shift there. So ethics approval is still ongoing. I've been told it could be up to 15 months. So there is a group here at UBC, the Prison Health Group, that have been a resource for us to getting through some of these hoops. But it is, I guess it is what it is. And it's interesting, the conundrum, ethics approval is cumbersome and lengthy, and yet the protection of harms for the inmates, there's been very few questions about that. So to me that's an interesting environment where we seem to, I think, at UBC now have a fairly quick turnaround, but lots of concern about risks and harms, particularly for vulnerable populations. Extensive amount of work we do. So it's almost the reverse in CSC. Lots of slow processes, but the focus around harm and reduction of risk is minimal. It wasn't much, didn't really need much about that for the inmates. And I think it's got to do with the fact that they're inmates and their personal freedoms are limited anyway, so we don't need to really worry about harm. So I don't know if that's been published anywhere, that conundrum, but I think it's fascinating. So ethics approval is a lengthy and different experience than here at UBC. Partnership is challenging because this project's had tons of media, but our CSC partners have been limited in their capacity to speak as a CSC employee. So I go off and it's about a 6-week approval if you want to speak to the media. So our CSC partner is I'm thinking of bad words, but her freedom to speak is limited. So, and that's not okay if you're a researcher who uses participatory co-lead models. It's problematic. Participant engagement limitations. So in most of the work that I do, I use participatory approaches. The men are co-analysts or participants can be involved in analysis. They can challenge the interpretations, like most of the work that I do, because that's the protocol in the communities that I usually work in. And in First Nations context, that shared knowledge creation is we all sign, and that means I don't go away and decide what I've learned, and it's a fait accompli. So their time to be involved in that was not accepted. Could we have an hour with the men beyond the regular workshop hours to do analytic work together? So we're not allowed to do that, and we're not allowed to do any incentive or reward. And we actually have to be very clear that engagement in the project will not lead to sentence reduction. And so it's that there can't be any rewards. And so that runs counter to some of the honoring of our participants in other outside a correctional facility. Informed consent is then also an important process to engage in because personal freedoms are already next to zero. So the consent process and our forms, and you can imagine, we like to think about what people do have the right to, and our forms are very much about what they don't, and it is on the basis of no personal freedoms. So that's, as researchers, I think, really important. The Tsilhqot'in Communities is so, I didn't really see this one coming either, although I was well aware of the 2014 land title decision. The Tsilhqot'in National Government were the first ever to receive Supreme Court decision to land title for the Namaya Valley, and it means they're exempt from the Forestry Act too. So all the Crown forestry practices they're exempt from, and they have complete control over the largest amount of land outside a reserve system in Canadian history. So we go into the Tsilhqot'in communities and talk about our research, and that context is highly significant for creating a research agreement around governance and protection of Indigenous land, knowledge, heritage. Many more layers to a really important process. So we just, as of last week, signed an MOU with the TNG, Tsilhqot'in National Government, and given their particular experience in the Supreme Court decision and their savvy around protection of cultural knowledge, I think it's really exciting that the School of Nursing has an MOU with the TNG. That was probably about 6 months worth of work, and really important work, and it already feels like a huge success to have that. And then we have an element of here where we've got children and families in a community, and we have inmates, and there's many layers of consent in the project realm. So just to kind of wind down, I thought I can't give you a lot of data right now, but we have permission to use quotes, and we have a video pitch that, to me, even though it's pre-research, is all of our data. We have permission for the quotes and the images from the time period that we spent with the men to get ready for the video. And the video is a 5-minute with the men, with images talking about what they know to be the impact already. So we were kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but it's pretty great. So these are some of the things the guys have already said and are very much, I think, going to be in sync with the kind of data I might be able to come back in 6 months and share. They talk about it being the only thing that soothes their mind and getting a cell permit so I can do this at night. One of the guys has said, and this is the difference than some of the other programming, I never had a bed as a child, so it makes me feel good to make this for someone. I imagine what it'll be like for this little boy or girl to receive a bed. So furniture is coming out of mountain, and mostly beds and picnic tables, but the men talked about, like, to imagine the kids actually having a good night's sleep and waking up and doing better in school the next day. And they start to even have helped us see the impacts that we want. And linking it to their own childhood experience has been really kind of cool. For the first time in 15 years, I started thinking about somebody other than myself. And they said, when I'm in the hobby shop or I'm doing yard work, I'm not really thinking about anybody, giving to anybody else. This guy, he has a lot of airtime on the video. Making things for kids in a community not far from where I grew up. I never had some of these things, and now all I want to do is focus on giving. It makes me feel good inside, even in this place. And the other guys on the video say, like, just because we're in jail doesn't mean we can't help people. Like, it's just, it's so basic in terms of their self-worth. The other thing that we're going to focus on is they were told what they were going to make in the beginning. We need beds, picnic tables. And when they started saying, well, why, can we come up with ideas? So in the medium security institution, in the workshop, it's called the drawing board. It's a whole wall of ideas. And these are all things that they've had printed off the internet that they've had access to. This is a paint chart from Rona because they can get some paint from there, and so they're picking color, design, and the idea here is says if we can draw it, we can build it. So tapping creativity, and one guy said, I wake up and I dream of things I can make, and he even said months before that, like, all I ever have is nightmares. So it's got something else to think about. Just in terms of the research on impact on the communities, just to mention that so the impact on the men, impact on communities. It's so interesting when I thought what I thought we were going to study was the thanks. I mean, I knew it would be deeper than that, but I kind of got uncomfortable when we went to the communities because we thought we were saying, what does it feel like to get all these things? And all the community members and some of the people who've received items said, we don't want you to study that. Because for us to give thanks and feel gratitude reflects that we had some really, really basic needs for our kids and our communities that we couldn't meet. And we don't want to talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that, oh, well, thanks for the bed. My kid never really had a bed. So that's not the data they want us to collect. The idea of meeting basic needs. What they want us to study in terms of impact is the indigenous ways to give people a second chance. That's a quote. That's the impact, because we're going to give our men a second chance, and that's what our contribution is. So that's primarily where we're going to focus. I think we'll have some people talk about the meeting of basic needs. So these are my words. We're not doing research to solicit gratitude, and I almost kind of thought we could have gone down the wrong path there. The community members and the inmates have both used this language. They say, you've got to study it because it's restorative justice. That's what it is. In the video, when I can get the link and you'll hear, he says it like 30 times. That's what it is. And so I think some of our outcomes and impacts will take up that language, and we think that that's an important part of sustaining the project in the CSC environment. Just a couple of things, because I can't show you much more data. They were making rocking horses for like months, and they was like, we don't want to make rocking horses. That's for those prairie Indians. It's prairie Indians or prairie natives. We're going to make rocking orcas. So they do rocking ravens, rocking orcas, and they just made a Canucks rocker. And it's amazing, and I didn't put it out because we're currently trying to figure out if we could get it to the GM of the Canucks and see if we could get some. Because it's amazing. So this is almost like a taking pride in history, culture, and what's meaningful, and that wasn't ever part of it originally. It was, can you make an orca or a rocker? So we're going to look at offender transformation and rehabilitation institutions, community restorative justice, and think about this in the term of crime prevention, because the guys are convinced inside that if they can, one of the impacts they can have is they can show kids in communities that you can find your way back to a good life, and by giving to others is a way. So they want to put together a documentary that goes to youth as a crime prevention kind of thing. Like, this is my story, and I've had the chance to do something different, and I'm never coming back here because of it, and I want to share it. So that crime prevention piece is coming in. And then the goal also is the long-term sustainability and scalability of the project. I probably could have spent the whole time just showing you pictures of everything we've made and what people have said, and that's going to be the really fun part. It's kind of like, this is the container for it all. So that's a little rocker that was made. So we have lots of pictures of the kids. This was Christmas in July. A shipment went up last year, and they had them kind of mock Christmas, and all the kids. I mean, the pictures of these kids walking away with their toys and their moccasins, and it's amazing. It's endless the amount of photos that can be shown and that are being shown to the men. And that's actually one point I didn't mention. We now have another area of data collection in that the person from the community has been taking pictures of the kids getting these things and going into the prisons and showing them to the men. And we realized the other day that every time she does that, that's another place to collect data, because some of the men are being in tears seeing the impact that they're having and the sense that they can do something good. And then after the presentations, some of them will say, like, what do we mean we only have 15 minutes left in here? You know, we should get together and try and see if we can get this another hour added on in the programming. And so it spurs more work that they're undertaking to do their own kind of sustaining of the work in the institutions. So I don't know where we are for time or how long.
Yeah, we've got some time for some questions.
Good.
I've got a couple. What's it like working with Movember? You know, I mean, very different model. You know, like aside from the pitch being a video, but just I think they're very hands-on. You know, and just you know, I guess you've reflected on some of that because it's quite different to other academic research funding streams.
Yeah.
Just wondering, you know.
Yeah. I was, when you must have sent me that link, I thought, you know, I've always it was refreshing and real,
Yeah.
right? It was so, and of course, like the idea of a visual pitch, right, for something compelling and innovative versus a 12-page grant was so, well, it was so exciting. And to go and talk to my very new partners and say, we're going to do a video and we're going to show, well, we can't show this to the world yet, but, you know, we're going to show the world what's going on in here. They were excited, and they then thought having an academic partner was kind of a cool thing.
Yeah.
But my other grants, sometimes I go to my academic partners and say, we have like this, we have to fill this out, and sorry, I can't put you as a co-lead because you don't, you know, have post-secondary education, and you know, there's all these adjustments to fit community-based research into this traditional academic form. And here was a package where many partners and different contributions were of value and a form for telling our story that was so much more compelling. And not only that, at the time I was figuring out what Movember was about, and I had an awareness. I went back and was reading the report cards from and got really excited and was thinking, this is to me, this is another form for some of the research that I've been doing, which I call community-based participatory research, which is real problems, real solutions, real partners, kind of sounds like a slogan, but that's what this was. And yet it had a different form,
Yeah.
completely different form than the other grants. In responsiveness. And, you know, I think Ivy and a few of them had a question, they were there. You know, and they knew, I think they understood the nature of the question, which is sometimes not been my experience in the more traditional format. The other thing I noticed is when in the review, in the process of the panel review, if we have further questions, we'll contact you. Like, wow! Oh, so if I missed a link or a connection, I'm not thrown out of the ring, because if they really like it, they're going to call me. And they did, and they called me and they said, I can't remember who I talked to. So it's for Aboriginal men. How have Aboriginal people been involved in the very inception of the work? Where is Aboriginality in this? Where is the Indigenous? Where is the... It was beautiful. It was like, of course that's the best question in the world. I didn't say a word about that. But I didn't really know how the consultation. And so we got the project, Melissa and myself on the phone. We had a 3-way conversation. And it was, like that to me is such a supportive way of helping new ideas come to fruition, because they moved us by the very nature of the question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I should just say, and then our research manager got the toolbox, the Movember toolbox a couple weeks ago, like with all the graphics, and she was like, so we've got a website under development, and she'd kind of stalled on it, but then all of that support, technology support and branding and logo came into her inbox, and she emailed me, and she goes, oh, I'm so motivated now to get our story out. So it's that kind of, that's not another report, that is pure resource and facilitation. So that's really exciting. Kind of feels like, you know, we could learn a lot in the traditional world about hands-on kind of support.
Yep. Yeah. No, thanks for that. Bill Mussell said to me, I reckon, almost a decade ago now, he said that he wondered whether masculinities was actually something for First Nations or for, some subgroups of men. He questioned whether it actually fit. I wondered. I appreciate it's embedded in how you're going into the project, and there's lots of literature to suggest that it's within prison populations in general. But I just wonder if you have any insights about is it a natural fit, or are there other things at play there that you could hang your theory hat on, or the way you talked about?
Well, it's interesting because before, as I mentioned, before we were going for this grant, we weren't thinking masculinity. I was thinking about the value for human beings, about meaningful work and not degrading work. I mean, that's what we were hearing, like the yard work. And, I was really excited because the social determinants of health, and Sally Thorne actually brought this up at a presentation. We talk about work, living conditions, the list, but we don't talk about meaningful work, right? And so I was really thinking about self-worth, value, giving. I wasn't really thinking about this idea of like your tool shed, like your men's sheds, like the working together productivity, like what I know about what I've read, until the grant kind of the light sort of shifted that way. And then when I brought it to the guys and I told them about Movember and we were doing this, they were like, oh yeah, I feel good, but I feel good because I'm productive and I'm, my culture it's a warrior, one guy said it's a warrior spirit. That's a doing spirit. Yeah. That's a doing. And I started thinking there is a gendered, there's something really important about gender here. And, well, it wasn't all men's prison, so, we had this already. But they said and there's something about a life, again, they talked about gang life and life of crime, that when you can't feel productive in your giving, that if those things are important to them as men, then when you aren't doing those things, the slide into a life of crime has a gendered kind of nature to it. So one of the partners in the community said, that's all great you're doing that, but what about when they get out? Like, what's for them when they get out? How do you sustain that meaningful? He said, because that will keep them from going back to crime. And recidivism and all of that for women is different than for men. And that's what his point was. Value, contribution, productivity, warrior spirit, caretaking, action orientation. That's all he said. That's an Indigenous man. That's what his... So I guess when I think about that, he's pointing to an Indigenous form of masculinity that is particular to their lives and history. So the caretaking when you can't take care of others, you don't have the resources to take care of others. I guess he said, that it's not a matriarchal, there's this misread of patriarchy, matriarchy. He argued more that doesn't exist, that we've got that all wrong. But the caretaker, man is caretaker of nation and community, which links with the hereditary chieftainship and potlatch, and giving and potlatches. I think there's a dynamic there, social dynamic that is probably, but maybe if we think we know what masculinity might mean in that context, we've probably got it all. Yeah. So that's really interesting. I mean, it's great because when we get a little further around the piece around masculinity as enlisting the positive side of that, what they'll tell us that we could learn to contribute to that would be really neat. Yeah,
no, I think it's would be one of the strengths of what you come up with, no doubt. I had just another one. I've done a little bit of work with prisons, with Ruth over at Medicine, but just for maybe our viewers and stuff, federal prison versus provincial prison, and you mentioned minimum minimum, maximum, medium.
Yeah.
Could you just clarify that a little bit? Like the guys who you're working with, you know, what facility they're in terms of, you know, where they could be, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is where somebody like, you know, like having Melissa be able to, freely speaking, come here today would have been great, because some of this is, you can imagine. I know that in the provincial system they're called jails, in the federal system they're called prisons, so that's a good starting point. And that if you commit a criminal offense, that federal criminal offense, that you're in the prison system, and that depending on the sentence, you're in a minimum, medium, maximum, and that many of the men that are in a minimum have moved from a medium to a minimum, or from a maximum to a, so there's a lot of movement around these institutions, and that's. But I don't actually know, well, what, like a B&E is probably treated, the sentence is governed within the provincial system. And so I think what we have are the higher risk offenders in the federal system because of the nature of the offense. And interestingly enough, they, in Williams Lake, there's something like 12 prolific offenders in BC, and they're named people who not necessarily committed the worst crime, but the most, and again and again and again. And I think the chief from there told me that 8 or 9 live in Williams Lake. So it's interesting that this is where we're doing the study. That some of the most, they call them prolific offenders. Isn't that interesting? Prolific. It sounds kind of great, but are living in the very communities that these guys are doing the work for. So that's the federal, that comes out of the federal system, and it has to do with the nature of the crime.
Yeah.
So but I don't know where the line goes between the nature of the crime.
Yeah.
But I think we will be collecting data on the sentence of the guys.
Yep.
So we're going to learn. That's where I think I'm going to be really interested to learn more.
Yeah. Great. And I guess my other one was around ethics, and a lot of patience involved there.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And it's through now.
So UBC ethics approval is through. The TNG MOU and ethical protocol is done. So that's been quite a bit of work. And CSC is just in the last phases.
Great.
So we were told 50 months is the maximum. So we started in January, so we're in pretty good shape.
Yeah. Great.
But I do, we don't always have that much published on sort of ethics, the nuances of ethics. And this is there's just so much in this around I mean, there is a section there isn't in the Tri-Council policy in vulnerable populations. We were looking for specific things around doing research with inmates, and you can glean some practices, but there isn't anything particular to having 0 personal freedoms, which is quite interesting, because and I know it's going to happen. I can just see it now in our array of doing research. I'm going to be wanting to give the kind of freedoms that we're trained to as researchers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they say I can bring as many donuts as I want. That's good. Donuts. Lots of donuts. But I don't know, like the idea of saying, I'd really like to come back and have another conversation with you to make sure I've got this right. I mean, it's just so basic. And yet, any time outside of workshop time, we won't have access to it.
Yeah.
So we're doing this as they're working, right? So that's interesting from a reflexive kind of position. I'm going to be influencing, I know what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be trying to give personal freedoms where they aren't allowed in the research, but we have to uphold this kind of these other practices which are about. Oh, because somebody said to me, don't shake their hands, Helen, because they always put their hand out, right? Nice to meet you. Don't shake their hands. I'm like, don't shake their hands. They're like, really, you shouldn't shake their hands. Okay, I should probably shake their hands. I guess it's just, you don't shake their hands. It's really fascinating. And you're only there because you see what they're doing is so important. So you're already giving them an interaction which is different, right, than some of their other interactions. So you're influencing, the very thing by your presence, because my engagement with them is completely, what they did and everything it's not part of my story in this moment, so I have a different way of interacting, right, which is, from a research perspective, it'll make for some interesting field notes and
Andrew, James.
So are they still happy enough to talk to you when their time is limited in the workshops?
Yeah, some of them are. Some of them want to show us what they're making, but they don't want their face.
Okay.
They don't want any photographs. So, yeah, they're mostly proud of what they're making and walk us through the idea, where it came from. Usually their originality in it. One of the guys said that he had some memories of being taught how to carve from his grandfather, but it wasn't until he got a tool in his hand and a piece of wood that he remembered. So he was saying, he didn't say, "Oh, I now know how to carve." He said, I'm a carver." Like, his whole identity was, "I'm a carver." It comes to show and do it. I'm a carver. I just didn't know it, until I got the chance to do this. So that's where the pride is, I think, in the sense of, and of course, our presence is purely there to honor that, and so their heads are a little bit higher, I think, as we're walking around. Yeah, I think there will be a lot of that. Yeah, I don't think that's going to go for the whole 2 years. We'll be out there every other month looking at the stuff, especially the new ideas like that, orca. One of the guys said, "Did you send that to the folks at UBC, the Canucks orca? You should send that to those, so they get really excited about."
I have a question about the term meaningful work. So that's definitely a term that's been resounding very strongly within this project, as we've heard. So how does Work to Give define the term meaningful work, and has it changed since the program's inception?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so meaningful work at this point, we're thinking about work that promotes a positive sense of self and of feeling valued and of self-worth, value, identity. That's not really around the productivity, you've seen that word, productive contribution. It's really around self-worth, identity, feeling valued. Because we heard that over and over and over. One guy said, you do this work, it's just great, the video, you just love it. You kind of develop those things, what are they called? Morals. I love it. Morals. I never had morals before. I'm only laughing because it's just, the morals thing always, do you have morals? It's I've got, for the first time I've got morals. So, you could, what you want to call that is, maybe an understanding of self as a moral being, or something. But definitely, and I don't associate them, I don't gender those, right? That's the interesting thing. It's a great question. And I think that's where we're starting, and I think it's going to grow in terms of what we learn about impact. What do we mean by, what is meaningful work as a rehabilitative process? Oh, the other thing you can't forget, they said, you learn to work. I never knew how to work with other people. I never worked with other people. Well, unless we were going to take something down, right? These guys said it. But you come in, if you're new to the shop, you're mentored by the guys that have been there for a while, and then they work as a team. So team skills, communication, team, collaboration, feedback. And the mentor saying to the younger guys, he said, they come in, they're not always behaving that well, you're wondering what they're going to take, and then you realize, they're not ready for this. So I talked to the supervisor, and they're not ready for this. So that leadership, mentorship, teamwork is probably a dimension of meaningful work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question, and I'm not sure if you've looked into this at all or not, but how do you think this project has specifically affected these incarcerated Aboriginal men's families? So their elders, their siblings, their children, spouse.
That's so great, because one guy said, oh, so I went out and showed after we got the project, we took a lot of donuts, we got the grant, we went out and we showed the video to the guys. I think we showed it to as many of the guys that were in it as possible. One had been transferred, he had a big role, so I don't know if he's seen it, because we can't seem to find him. But we took it out and showed them across the 3 institutions, and so many of them came up after or said, most of them came up after, can you send this to my mom? Can you show this to my family so they can be proud of me? Like, it was, I mean, that was the, yeah. So, I think that, like, this is the best, this is the first good thing. If they're going to be proud of me, they're going to know I'm doing something good. They're proud of me. So, impact, yeah. So what the guys actually want to do is make a much longer documentary of what they're doing for their families. So we have a videography budget to do that, and I think it'll build on the video. But so yeah, getting our website up and going and getting our permissions around what we can show to families. But yeah.
Right. No, I think that's great. That's something that they themselves can take home, as opposed to giving out to the children and the in-need families. So I think that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Their own, what's important to them, and so many of them, I think. Yeah. I mean, a couple of guys said, one said I haven't had any contact with my mom since I got in here, but I'd like to now, because I'm not sure with this. So.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
So one last final question. I'm wondering if this program has kind of a goal set to do work that helps these men reintegrate back into society once they're finished with their term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can imagine all our partners in the Tsilhqot'in have said, well, this is great, but what are we going to do when they're back in our communities? Like, this has to keep going, it has to get bigger, it's getting bigger. Support this rehabilitation post-release. So we're thinking about like another grant, like something that really focuses there. So we did put a letter of intent in, and it didn't get accepted forward, so that was kind of disappointing. But it was the chief, he's a counselor, and he was in one of the photos, said, you know what I do when the guys come back here? I take them out to this, he teaches them how to hunt and trap. He said, because they're sitting home in their living rooms, and before you know it, they're back in their old ways. He said, I teach them new ways. So he said he does his own money, his own time. He said, I'm going to help them be warriors and caretakers. So I wrote a LOI talking about that we were going to study what he's doing as this, supporting this community reintegration and reducing recidivism rates by tapping this warrior spirit, right? Somebody didn't like it. Can you believe it? It's awesome. And then we were going to take this program that he has and evaluate and look at it and research it, and then try to bring it into the Aboriginal programming at the specific site called Kwì, which is an Aboriginal minimum security, and create a whole new circle here of post-release and what's happening for Aboriginal men in this specific healing. It's called a healing center, although it's a minimum security institution. So there's so much to do. And I mean, really, we had to, the leaders in the nation that we were meeting with were really like, yeah, you've only got this one slice in time, and you're missing so much. We're not really missing it, we just only got this grant to do this, and so there's so much more. I mean, this is already sort of mushroomed out, and we got a very good size grant, but there's the post-release piece we really, I don't think, can tackle. But we will cycle back next year.
Yeah.
To something else.
Well, I guess just a thank you. What a great project, and again, the innovation grants are coming up again this year, so you never know.
Yeah.
But I think it's great work, and really look forward to hosting you again when you're further down the track to see a little bit more of what you've done, and no doubt we'll include the video within the video of this webinar. So thanks again, Helen.
Thank you. It's great. Love talking about this. Could do it all day. Thanks for having me.